Yeah.
All right. Hope everybody is well. Welcome to our Thursday night New York Giants Preservation Society meeting. Tonight we have privilege to have Doug Greenwald, who is announcer for the Fresno Grizzlies and has great ties to the Giants. Just some paperwork. Next week we will not have a guest. The following week, I'm working on getting somebody from the Giants for the MLB trade deadline. I have made some calls and I'm waiting responses. As we move into August, we have Dan Faust, who wrote The Giants Experience. We're going to follow him with Terry Cashman, the baseball balladeer. And then Barbara Ott, Mel Ott's daughter, will be joining us on the 19th of August. When September rolls around, we're going to have Mo Resner with the last game at the Polo Grounds. And Josh Prager will be coming aboard September, I believe, 29th, which is a huge day in Giant history. And he'll be talking about the 70th anniversary of the shot heard around the world, which he wrote about in the Echoing Green, one of the best baseball books around. So tonight we have Doug Greenwald. Doug has been doing Fresno Grizzlies games for a long time. They are no longer associated with the Giants. They are a Rockies affiliate. He's going to talk about his career and also about his father, Hank, who many of you have heard with some, amazing calls over the years. The Joe Morgan home run, and of course, the Will Clark hit off Mitch Williams, which was just a great call. Doug, welcome aboard.
Gary and company, thank you.
Hopefully we'll have some more people coming in. We got a nice crowd tonight. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind. Last week, we had the privilege of having Phil Mushnick, who is a sports writer here in New York. And he knows your family, and he seemed very upset about what happened with your dad's tenure here in New York. Do you know anything about it, or did Dad confide with you what happened with the Yankees?
Well, you know what, and again, thank you for having me, and it's great to meet all of you. It was actually nothing to do with the Yankees. The falling out was with WABC Radio. As my dad would often say, or people would come up to him, man, Hank, sorry that George treated you that way. And my dad would say, George and I got along fine. It was the only thing that George didn't really have his hands in. And that was the radio situation with the Yankees when my dad was there. So it was WABC. When he was hired there after 1986, he was given a 2-year guaranteed contract, and then the station had an option. And if they picked it up, it would be another 3 years automatically. After the first year, there was a switch in management, and a new GM came in and didn't understand that my father actually worked for a living. And you could tell that wasn't going to go over too well. And my dad knew the writing was on the wall throughout the 1988 season. So it was during that time when the Giants were going to have a switch in '89, and that switch meant going from KNBR having the rights to the games to the Giants having the rights to the games. And when my dad left the Giants in '86, it was because of a falling out with KNBR, but he never had an issue with the Giants. And when the Giants took over the rights, they knew my dad would be available, and he came back. But yeah, as I tell people that George Steinbrenner and my father had no issues at all. That wasn't the thing. It was WABC. That was the falling out.
Got it. And I got one other question. This is for you. On HBO, they're playing a lot of parental guidance with Billy Crystal as Artie Decker, as he calls him, the voice of the Grizzlies. I know you have done some Giant games in the past. Is that a lifetime goal for you to get back there, or you're confident in what you're doing now?
My goal is to be with any major league team. I'm no different than any broadcaster in the minor leagues or any player in the minor leagues. Our goal is to get to the big leagues. And in the case of players, it's called player development, not Giant development, not Angel development, not Yankee development. It's called player development. It's to get to the big leagues. You're really playing for all 30 teams. Same thing when you're a broadcaster. We're not under contract by our parent club. So, for example, the Rockies are the parent club of the Grizzlies, but I'm not paid by the Rockies. I have nothing to do with them in terms of employment. So my goal is to get to a major league team, any major league team, to broadcast.
You certainly have the voice. You and Dan, Dan's on here all the time. You guys must make an incredible pair. So
I've always enjoyed working with Dan, and somebody knows not just more about baseball than I do, a lot more about baseball than I do. So Dan keeps me on my toes, but I've learned a lot about certainly the Fresno area, all levels of baseball in Fresno. He comes up with always great interview suggestions, and I know that I don't have to look things up. If I have a question about Fresno, I just go to Dan.
Do you want to, before we get other questions, you want to give us a little background information on your career?
Well, it's my 25th season. Let's see here. Well, I guess last year didn't really count, but so I guess my first year was 1996. So what are we, 2000 and well, yes, I guess this would be year 25 for me. I have been very fortunate to do work at all levels of professional baseball. All the 12 years of doing webcasting work with the Giants in spring training, a handful of regular season games with them on the radio. And from there on to independent league ball, single A, double A, triple A, Hawaii Winter League. So I've really seen and have been fortunate to do all levels of professional baseball. But there's no doubt that I haven't known life any other way. When people say, "Well, gee, Doug, when did you want to get into it?" And I figured, well, maybe when I was 12 or 13, when I realized I wasn't a very good player, but I still wanted to be around it, and knew that I had a built-in professor at home to teach me the ropes, and could, most kids can't go to the doctor's office if their dad's a doctor, or go to the courtroom if their dad's a lawyer, but they can go to the ballpark and hang out in the booth. So I was, fortunate to do that. And no doubt that the Giants have always been in my blood. I was just in my dad's office the other day, and my mom and I were going through some of his stuff, and he still has portions of bookshelves dedicated to the Polo Grounds, not so much San Francisco, but to the Polo Grounds. And whether it be a portrait, or whether it be books on Bobby Thompson, or just books of the old Giants. I even have an old book that he gave me that was written by Christy Mathewson in 1912 that I have in my room. So he has the old New York Giant jerseys back in the 40s, when they actually strayed away from the orange and black. They were red, white, and blue colors for a few years. And he has that jersey up there with the cap. So in a way, my father would always say, when he was doing the Giants for all those years, he said, "I still can't believe the Giants are in San Francisco." And here he is working for the San Francisco Giants. But his words were often, "I still can't believe they're out of the Polo Grounds."
That's great. Bill Klink, take it away. Turn on your mic, Bill. Bill, turn on your mic.
I'm on now. You always ask us to mute, so I did follow directions. So anyhow, I wanted to read to you real quickly, Doug. This is from the Chronicle. Actually, October 1st of 99, when they closed down Candlestick, I was there, and I picked up this paper. There was a story on calling it the way they saw it. There's only one announcer I'm interested here in reading to you about. That's Hank Greenwald. He was the lead broadcaster from 82 to 86. He was also a part of the team in 89 to 96 and 79 to 81. He was said to be a man who built much of his reputation with his dry wit, but he never found anything funny about Candlestick. Candlestick certainly was responsible for some of the minuscule crowds drawn during Greenwald's first stint with the club. That provided him with an opportunity to flex his humor muscles. He recalled one day they announced the crowd was 1632. Then I said, 1632, that's not a crowd, that's my shirt size. Greenwald said that he learned much of his broadcasting lessons at Candlestick from the esteemed play-by-play man, Vin Scully. When I started, we always left the windows open. That was just the way it was. It was something of a macho thing, I guess. Then one cold night in 82 or 83, I looked over at Vin, and he's got the window closed, and he's comfortable. And then I started thinking, this guy's going to be in the Hall of Fame. And I'm just another announcer. If it's good enough for him, it's good enough for me. So thanks to Vin, there was no more shame in keeping the windows closed. Greenwald's favorite moment at Candlestick isn't hard to guess. The final out of the 89 clinching game against the Cubs, because of what it represented to the organization and to the long-suffering fans. Greenwald's call was Bedrosian throws to Sandberg, and the pitch is grounded to second base. Thompson has it. Throws to first. It's over. 27 years of waiting have come to an end. The Giants have won the pennant. I want to tell you, the best call I ever heard him make, and he made it a lot of times, was not in baseball. It's when he called the Warriors basketball. And his one I loved was 18-footer goes 17. He never called it an air ball. 18-footer goes 17. He was a great announcer. I loved listening to him. Probably second only in the Giants panoply to Hodges. I'd put him ahead of Simmons. That's just me. That's just me. Thank you. Thank you, Doug.
Thank you, Bill, and appreciate the kind words. And I'll touch just for 1 second on the basketball lingo. He would leave all the tells it like it is with basketball to Bill King. So that's a whole different Zoom. But no, regarding his quote love of Candlestick, no, he hated Candlestick, never made it a secret about it. So I asked him once. I said, Dad, and because there was some talk when the city of San Francisco was going to demolish Candlestick, there was some talk if it would be imploded or go down gradually, and it went down gradually. They took the cannonball here, or the wrecking ball here and there. But I said to my dad once, I said, Dad, if somebody hired you to push the button to implode Candlestick, would you? He says, you bet I would. There was no sugarcoating it, and he the final game ever at Candlestick, which was of course a 49ers game, and there was a lot of hoopla about it. And somebody phoned my dad, some writer in the Bay Area phoned my dad just to get some quotes about his memories of Candlestick. And someone said, Hank, this writer said, Hank, what is your favorite memory of Candlestick? And he says, it hasn't happened yet. So, no, the dry wit about Candlestick, he never made any secret about it. He said the only thing that he liked about it was its unique name. It wasn't just called Giants Ballpark or San Francisco Stadium or anything like that. He said at least Candlestick, because it was of course there at Candlestick Point, and I'm not even sure how Candlestick Point got its name, but no, Candlestick Park was not a favorite of my dad's.
Anybody else with another question?
Yeah,
Go ahead, Lee.
Yeah, I really enjoyed him with Tim Hutton.
Tommy Hutton?
Yeah, with Tommy Hutton. Yeah, they were a great duo. What were his favorite parks? We know what he didn't like, but what were his favorite parks?
Well, the Polo Grounds. And I know what you meant by that question. You probably meant more as a broadcaster. But the Polo Grounds was one of his favorite parks because when he had moved to Rochester in the 1940s, the family trip was often in the summertime down to New York City. And I think the first time, and he still has a little black and white photo of it, and it's marked on the back, Polo Grounds, Boston Braves and New York Giants, 1948. So he was about 13. And he just fell in love with the geometry of the Polo Grounds, the 500 feet to center field, and the 297 or whatever was down the lines. But that was definitely one of his favorite ballparks. That's why we still have, not only does he have a big painting of the Polo Grounds still in his office, but you remember the scoreboard there where they have the Chesterfield cigarette billboard attached to the scoreboard in center. There's he ordered something on, I don't know when it was, but just like a little, I guess, replica of that he puts on the front door of his office. So I think the Polo Grounds really was his favorite ballpark. Tiger Stadium, or at the time Briggs Stadium, because he he was born in Detroit, lived his first 10 years in Detroit. So that was his first major league ballpark, was Briggs Stadium. So that's always going to have a soft spot for him. The first time he ever went to a major league game, he was 8 years old. And he was telling me about it. He said, yeah, it was the Philadelphia A's and the Detroit Tigers. And I know I might have been 10 or 11, when you start figuring things out a little bit. I said, wait a minute, Dad, Philadelphia A's, you actually saw Connie Mack manage? He says, yeah, I actually saw Connie Mack manage. So Briggs Stadium to him. And then Briggs Stadium, his dad took him to game 1 of the 1945 World Series. And for 72 years, my dad would always brag that he's one of the few who actually saw the Cubs play in a World Series, because it was game 1 of the Tigers and Cubs. But in terms of the modern day ballparks where he got to broadcast, I think what's too bad is because he really retired before the new wave of ballparks. But without a doubt, Oracle Park, he, as he always said, he'd go to a lot of Giant games at the current stadium, and he would always shake his head and say, man, I still cannot believe there is a stadium in this city, in downtown San Francisco, that now everybody loves. And I define everybody as all baseball fans from everywhere. He still couldn't believe it. The few years that were between his retirement from the Giants and before the new stadium was built, he might go to a couple of games, but he hated Candlestick. Then once they moved to the new stadium, different story. He was there a lot. So that was definitely one of them. He liked Cleveland. My dad actually enjoyed, I guess it's not Progressive Field, but the ballpark in downtown Cleveland, he liked going. He came back to do a couple years on TV for the A's, and part of his contract, he could pick the cities, and he chose Cleveland as one of them. And when people are Cleveland, but yeah, he said he loved the ballpark, loved that area around there. So, but I would say, going back to your question, Fenway and Wrigley, sure, everybody loves those, and no doubt he loved them. But I think in terms of the old ballparks, it was the Polo Grounds and Briggs Stadium, and the modern ballparks would be San Francisco and Cleveland.
And I guess he likes Silver Stadium in Rochester too. Huh?
Well, that's where he really grew up in terms of a neighborhood ballpark. And unfortunately, I never got to see a game there. I know it's been torn down. But that's where he grew up, in a way, loving radio. That's where Jack Buck was doing games for the Rochester Red Wings when my dad was growing up there. So one of his stories about growing up and going to Silver Stadium. So he had just moved to Rochester. I think it was 1946, 45. But again, I want to say 1946. And one of his memories of going to Silver Stadium was seeing the Rochester Red Wings play the Montreal Royals, who had this experimental player named Jackie Robinson. And my dad would say, hey, I saw Jackie Robinson play in the minor leagues. And, it was something that was unusual. It was new. And you look back at it, that's one of his memories of going to Silver Stadium was seeing not just the Red Wings, but seeing some of the opponents. And certainly Jackie Robinson was one of them.
Great stories.
Fred Cohn, you're up.
Have you ever called, hi Doug, have you ever called a perfect game, a no-hitter or a triple play?
Dan Taylor knows the answer to part 1 of that question. No, I have, I should let Dan answer, but the answer is no. I never have. So 25 years of doing this, the closest I've ever been to calling, I've been nowhere near a perfect game. The closest I've ever come to a no-hitter has been 2 outs away. And I will count, in the case of the minor leagues, now, of course, the major leagues, I hate the 7-inning doubleheader rule, which it sounds like it'll go away next year. I certainly hope for that level. But the minor leagues, I was 2 outs away with Tim Lincecum, one of his 6 starts with the Grizzlies.
Really?
And it was a 7-inning doubleheader. And he had walked like 5-6 guys, but and Fresno was up comfortably. He's like 6-0. But I'm thinking, man, I might have a chance tonight. Lincecum's, if he's not walking him, he's mowing him down. And it was 1 out in the 7th, and he ends up walking a guy. Well, he had to come out then due to pitch count. And next guy that comes in was Billy Sadler, who loyal Giant fans probably remember Billy with the Giants, not a long big league career, but was with them, came up through Fresno as well. So he comes in to relieve Lincecum. All right, well, hey, I can still call a no-hitter. I don't care if it's a combined no-hitter. First pitch, he gives up base hit. So no, I have never come close to a perfect game. I've come close to a no hitter. Never have. Triple play, I've called a bunch of those, and one of those was the first major league game I ever did, regular season major league game I ever did. Giants at Brewers in 2009. Aaron Rowan hit into it, and it was just it wasn't a complicated triple play. It was around the horn. Randy Wynn was at second, Ryan Garco was at first, and Rowan hit a ground ball to third, and it was just 5-4-3 triple play. And then I had called one earlier that year in Fresno. And so I'm wondering if I'm possibly the only person in the same season who's called a triple play at AAA and in the big leagues. But yeah, I've called a few triple plays.
Have you ever called a game with your dad?
Not in an official sense, not like in a major league sense, but yes. I mean, I guess what you mean is he joined me in the booth in the minor leagues. Yes, I have. We did a TV game together back in 2012. He came to Fresno, and we did that game together, and we've done some other. I think that's really the only full game we've ever done together. I mean, he's joined me as a guest, and I mean, he was never one to come on and say, "Hey, let me come on the radio." But I'd have him on. My favorite story about my dad on the radio, really on the game that I was doing, was actually in 1999 when I was broadcasting for the Stockton Ports. And I know a lot of people think, and I guess it's true, my dad and I sound alike. And I happen to be in Stockton right now, but this was at the old ballpark in Stockton when I was doing games for the Ports. And actually, you know what? I take that back. The game was in San Jose, but I was broadcasting for Stockton. And it doesn't really get humid in San Jose, rarely does it, but it was that night, it was just a little muggy, and I was feeling nauseous, and it was right around game time. And I just was afraid that, the more I talk, the more I might, I'll spare the details, but I was going to get sick. My dad jumps in. Of course, he doesn't know who these players are. He has a roster on both teams, but he, doesn't have any background on it, understandably. He's understandably not going to have any prep work done. He hops in. I'm sitting downstairs in an air-conditioned office for 6 innings, and he's doing the game, just sight unseen. I come back. I was feeling a little bit. As it turned out, I didn't get sick, but I guess it worked itself out of me in a way, and I was okay. It did the last 3 innings of the game. The next day, my boss, I guess I was back at work. We were back in Stockton, I think, the next day, and my boss said to me something like, "Yeah, Doug, exciting 9th inning last night. Really not much action though for the first 6-7 innings, but I heard you." And all that. And I said, "Well, you know that I wasn't doing the game the first 6 innings." My boss said, "What do you mean you weren't doing the game? I listened to you. What are you talking about?" I said, "Well, here's what happened." I told him it was my dad. And he laughed. He says, "What? That was your dad? I thought that was you." Because my dad never gave his name. That's what he told me. He didn't say, "I'm filling in for Doug." He didn't say, "I'm Hank Green." He just say, "Back in the ballpark," and scores whatever. But no, we've done, I guess, a couple of games together, and that's always a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Steve, go ahead.
Doug, do you know the UCLA broadcaster Tim Wilhelm? Does that ring a bell?
I don't know that name.
Okay, not important. But my question to you is concerns Darren Sutton, who I've gotten to know. He's been to Sun City Grand like you were, but he's been here numerous times. It's constant. There's something, whatever. And he just got released again by the Angels. Is that something that you could apply for? Do they have somebody already in the wings?
Well, they just named Rich Waltz as the successor. Rich had been one of the finalists for that job anyway, so I guess there was already a short list of guys who were on the B list, I guess. I don't have unfortunately, I mean, there's one person to blame, and that's me. I don't really have a large TV background for that. I think it's one of those that if it was a legitimate opening, I would send my radio work, because you never know. I mean, they like your radio work. They might say, "Hey, we like your work, but let's get you down here, or let's, go into a studio. We want to see on camera." But yeah, that is something that under normal circumstances on a non-mid-season change that I'd apply.
Thank you.
Doug, with the illnesses in the Giants booth Any chance of them ever contacting you for a, a fill-in job? And would your contract allow that, or would you want to, not be a fill-in and remain doing what you're doing?
Well, my contract certainly allows it. I can miss any Grizzly game to do any major league game, anywhere, any team, no doubt about that. No, I've not been contacted by them. Joe Rizzo, who does the San Jose Giant games, who was my successor at San Jose or at spring training. Joe sounds like he will be. I know he's going to fill in this weekend. At least the Friday, Sunday games are playing in St. Louis. I mean, he'll be in San Francisco because the broadcasters aren't traveling, but he'll be doing those games. So it sort of indicates that if they need more backup, that Joe would be the guy. At least that's what it sounds like. But no, I've not been contacted for that.
And when you did the Giant games, the few games that you did, was it play-by-play, or would you be an analyst?
No, it was all play-by-play. Yeah, it was all the first game I did with them in 2009. I actually did by myself because it was in Milwaukee, and John Miller was still doing ESPN. And the reason why I got a chance to fill in because both Dave and John were missing the same weekend, which is rare. But John at ESPN and Dave and his wife Jessica were expecting their third child, so he had to stay back in San Francisco. So that allowed me the opportunity to go to Milwaukee. But the other regular season games I've done with the Giants, it's been either with JT Snow or Randy Wynn. Spring training games I've done with Sean Estes and Rich Aurelia. So the knowledge those guys have, firsthand knowledge. And I tell these guys, the former players, this. I said, you guys know more about baseball than I'll even dream about, because I have so much respect because they've been on the field. They know why the first baseman plays on the lip of the grass with 1 strike versus 2 strikes. They know why the outfield is going to be aligned. They know why a runner might have taken an extra base in a situation that maybe the fan doesn't. Because I tell people, I say to the former players, I said, hey, you butt in when you have to, because you're here to inform fans. They're here to learn from you. I'm here to learn from you. Anyway, so the majority of the games I've done one way or another have been with a former player, and they're fantastic. And what I also respect about all those guys I mentioned, they'll say, hey, Doug, we lean on you a little bit for learning the nuances of play-by-play or learning when to come in and to usher us in. And, the fact that there seems to be respect on both sides. They don't look at me as, oh, well, this guy's been in the minor leagues forever. No, they look at me as I know baseball. They know my background. They know and I've grown up around it. And there's been respect on both sides. And to me, that's very important.
Honestly, your voice is incredible. You sound just like your dad. And
well,
the few games that we were able to see here in New York, there was hardly any. Your father was the voice of the Giants for a long time. You sound just like him. You really do. It's great.
Well, he would thank you, and he would tell you that I'd rather sound like him than look like him. But that would be his quote, not mine. So,
wait, I'll ask one more, and then which one of his famous calls do you admire the most and like the most?
I would have to say the pennant winner in '89. I mean, because that capped it. I mean, that won the pennant. I mean, that was the only year that he ever made the playoffs, that his teams ever made the playoffs. I mean, as you all know, he covered really bad teams in the 80s. And that was also his first year back from New York. So right there, that really, symbolized the whole turning things around, because he was still there in 86 when the team started to turn things around a little bit, when they had the Will Clarks and the Robbie Thompsons and, guys like that were the team was turning the corner a little bit. You could tell things are up. And then, of course, he left for New York for a couple of years. But when he came back, that was the ultimate. So I would say when they won the pennant, the 27 years of winning have come to an end. That one, and I was in the booth with him for that. And that to share that moment literally sitting two feet from him was something I'll never forget.
I also remember him with the Kevin Mitchell bare hand, which was a classic call as well.
Yeah, that was, well, that's, you could tell that they were going to win the pennant in a few innings, or you had a pretty good idea. That's something you can maybe prepare a call. The Kevin Mitchell one, yeah, that one. And then Kuiper had a great line was, in my entire life, I've never seen that. My dad says, I think you're not alone. So,
Any more questions?
Yeah,
Jeff, go
sorry.
ahead. Jeff and then Renee.
Thank you, Gary. Doug, I'm sorry, I've never got the pleasure to hear your father or you broadcast. I'm a New Yorker. I heard the greats here, Bob Murphy, Lindsey Nelson, all those guys. But you did mention that your father called the '89 playoff games and the pennant winning. I gotta ask, how was the experience calling the World Series in '89 and the tragedy that happened during it?
Part A was not very good in terms of the actual games. I don't mean because the A's won all four. That's not. He didn't really feel like. I mean, yes, he knew how privileged he was. He never ever lost sight of that. Let me make that clear. But the first two games, which were in Oakland, the World Series is a little different when it comes now. At least it was then, because back then you had national radio. So you had, I think it was Johnny Bench and Jerry Coleman on CBS Radio. So they got dibs to, at least, it's assigned by Major League Baseball. It wasn't those two, but, Major League Baseball assigns the booths. So the two games in Oakland, the A's had their regular booth. CBS Radio had their booth. Then you had Spanish radio and I guess some other outlets. So my father and Ron Fairley, their setup was sitting behind the backstop at the Oakland Coliseum. And needless to say, I mean, yes, my father was thrilled to be calling a World Series, but he didn't think that Major League Baseball really handled that well, throwing the visiting radio down there. So he really didn't enjoy that part. The other thing was he didn't really feel that it was a World Series, because getting in the car and driving to Oakland, which is 35 minutes, the Coliseum that is 35 minutes from where we live in San Francisco. He always felt a World Series as you get on a plane and you go to Boston or you go to Toronto or you go to Cleveland. You go to a ballpark, you go to a city that you normally wouldn't get to. He never really felt that was a World Series, getting in the car and driving to the Coliseum. But I mean, yes, obviously the thrill of calling a World Series was such. The earthquake, part B to that, he was not in the booth when the earthquake occurred. He was in the press box because he was getting ready to announce when they introduced both teams and at a World Series. He was going to introduce both teams over the stadium PA. And so he was in the press box getting ready to do that because it was just after 5 o'clock and the game was supposed to start around 5:30. That's where he was. And then as it turned out, obviously everything got pushed aside and he never got to that point of doing and I can't even remember if he did them when the series resumed or not, but that's where he was. And then I think he was able to get back on the radio and just said, I can't remember what he said, but my family and I were all in different spots. My sister was with a friend at one part of the ballpark. My mom was at one of those parties that they throw for everyone at the postseason. And the majority of all of you who seem to be New Yorkers or that area, I was outside my father's booth talking to one of the great baseball minds and still is baseball reporters in New York, Ed Randall. I'm sure most of you know Ed or know of Ed. Ed was out there just covering the World Series. And I hardly knew Ed, but I was talking to him and all of a sudden I'm saying, what's going on here? And things are starting to shake and he and I are looking at each other and he's like, hey, get down. I'm like, well, no, let's get in the booth. We didn't, I knew what to do a little bit because being from San Francisco, we would practice earthquake drills. Generally, that means when you're at the house, not at a 60,000 seat stadium. And it was that one moment where Ed and I have been friends since. So whenever I see Ed, and we talk usually a few times a year, it's usually what we talk about. Overall scheme of things, very tragic, very sad, loss of life. A lot of people lost their lives and homes. I don't, and none of you are trivializing at all because it was an awful moment. But yeah, that's where my dad was in the press box, and I was outside his booth.
Renee, you're up.
Doug, I got a question regarding you and your dad. With all the years of play-by-play both of you have done, did each of you have a favorite player that you enjoyed covering and interviewing? Any funny stories following that? Um, yeah, that's my question.
Yeah,
Thank you.
good question. My dad, he had a lot of guys he really liked. I mean, you could point to most Giants that he liked. He enjoyed certainly the Will Clarks and the Robbie Thompsons and Matt Williams of the world, but his first group of Giants back in '79, Terry Whitfield's and definitely Vida Blue was always one of his favorite guys. Really liked them. But my father he always felt that those guys are there every day. It was the guys he really liked were players that might have been on other teams. And his favorite player, I really think that outside of any Giant, was Andre Dawson. He loved, because Andre was that five-tool guy. He could run, he could hit for average, he could hit for power, he could throw, but he was all around a really good guy. And my dad always admired Andre Dawson, whether it be as an Expo or as a Cub. And that was a player he always enjoyed seeing. With the Yankees, loved Don Mattingly. Just because Don was in his heyday there in the 80s. And I realize the group to whom I'm speaking. But there were times, if the Dodgers were not playing the Giants, and let's say the Dodgers were in postseason, sometimes he would pull for the Dodgers because he really liked Don Mattingly and really felt that Don kind of got a bad rap just because if the Dodgers do well, if Don does well, it's because he's got a great team. And if they lose, well, blame Don. And my dad never liked that when people said that. So he was always a big Mattingly guy. And when the Dodgers would come play the Giants, he'd always make it a point to come by and say hello to Don Mattingly. But he liked a lot of those guys with the Yankees. I mean, Mattingly loved Dave Winfield, loved Ricky Henderson. Ricky, when my dad had his contract status became public in the in 1988, and there was, thought that my dad wasn't going to be back with the Yankees. Ricky Henderson came up to my dad and said, "You tell me who that new boss is. I'll go have a word with him." So it sort of sounds like something Ricky Henderson would say. Those were some of his favorites. But I mean, with the Giants, those guys, and I've not forgotten about Kruk and Kipe, but Kruk and Kipe are in their own category as broadcasters, because my father, they'll tell you the same thing. They taught. My dad was their mentor. So you like those guys. Love Bob Brenly, definitely BB, as everyone knows. Love those guys. So there's a lot, but I would say Andre Dawson for any opponent really would be the one guy that I think my dad really liked.
Doug, did the Giants do anything for your dad regarding either World Series rings or parades? Was he invited to that stuff, or?
Well, the parade really was no, because he wasn't part of the floats or anything, because he wasn't working for the team then. Nor was he ever given a ring for any of the World Series, because again, he wasn't working for the team. Right. I mean, he got a World Series ring for 1989, but reunions he was invited. So when they had I think it was 2016, they had a 30-year reunion for the 1986 team. And I know they didn't go to the playoffs that year, but that was a fun team. We talked about that, a lot of the rookies. So he was still very active. They would invite my father back for a lot of the reunions, or he would I will say this, when they had those World Series galas, he would be invited. He somehow was on the Giants media list, and like, why are they inviting me? But hey, I'll go. So and it wasn't just my dad, it was for the family. I mean, heck, I'd go. Certainly my mom would go. So but yeah, they would invite him back for reunions.
Yeah, they're very good with the history of the team, so I figured if they wanted, he was a longtime announcer, that they might invite him.
Yeah.
Harvey,
Yeah.
You're up.
Doug, what players did you like? Seeing the guys who came up with the Grizzlies, like Bumgarner and Posey, and I'm just throwing out two names, but what were your favorite? Who were your favorites that eventually wound up with the Giants?
Well, I mean, those certainly would be two of them, because both of them were so humble. I mean, the same Buster Posey, and I haven't seen him in a few years, but I went up to him and say, "Hey, Buster, hey, Doug, how you doing? How's things in Fresno?" It's just like, okay, he just had no ego. He led by example, I think, even in the minor leagues, that when Buster Posey walked in, that this was a guy that was going to get his work in, was going to play his way out of Fresno, and was going to go on and do what he's done. And I don't mean just individually, but obviously, I think it's any coincidence when he's stepped in the batter's box for the first time that things are going to change at the major league level. And I think 3 world titles can answer that. I'm not even talking about rookie of the year or batting champ or MVP, but just what he's done for the team. Bumgarner, I think as time has gone on in the major leagues, he's the no nonsense, cowboy kind of guy. But at Fresno was, hi sir, nice to meet you. Yes sir, no sir, how are you? Thank you for allowing me to do an interview with you. I mean, he would thank me for not to thank me. I have to thank you. But those two, we previewed them. It was 2010. They were on the cover of our first Grizzlies magazine, and they were both gone by June, which we figured. So those two definitely. Brandon Belt was a guy that I always enjoyed. Just real down to earth Texan. He was a lot of fun to be around. Brandon Crawford wasn't there all that long. He only played maybe 10 games for Fresno. Sergio Romo only played 10 games for Fresno. But Matt Cain was there for a full season. Very humble. At age 20, here he was at AAA, but always down to earth kind of guy, and always enjoyed being around Matt. There's never any problem with him. And then Lincecum was there quickly. Lincecum was there for about 6 games. And one of my favorite Lincecum stories is, and he certainly was one of my favorites, but we had a day game in Portland, and then after the game, we bus up to Tacoma. So normally Doug Greenwald, and Dan Taylor will tell you this, would be the only crazy one to, on a night off, go and watch more baseball. So we get up to Tacoma about 5:30. They play at 7. I go over to the game. It's a cold, typical rainy Northwest April night, but they got to get the game in. So it was just good enough to get the game in, good enough to play. I'm walking up toward the press box, which in Tacoma, the old configuration in Tacoma, you walk up to the stands and you take like a little catwalk staircase up toward the roof. That's where the press box was. As I'm walking toward the press box, and I see in the stands some guy yelling over to me, "Hey, Doug, hey, Doug." I'm like, he's yelling at me. I look over, it's Tim Lincecum. And he was with one of the other pitchers, Travis Blackley, who had a brief career with the Giants.
Mm-hmm.
They were both there. So I said to Lincecum, I said, "Tim, what are you doing here?" I said, "You're from this area. Why aren't you out with friends tonight? You got a rare night off in your home area." And he said to me, "Doug, I have to pitch tomorrow. Might as well come over and get an early look at the Rainiers hitters."
Mm-hmm.
So right there, that shows where his mind was, that, hey, I got a night off, but it's not a night off. I mean, how often do you get a live look at him? In a game where you don't have to be in the dugout is what I meant, where you can be in the stands. So that's really one of my favorite Lincecum stories. But
That's a great story.
yeah, I mean, that's Lincecum, Posey, Bumgarner all had this way about them where they all might be completely different kind of people, but they all had that same goal, and they achieved that goal. And obviously Matt Cain was part of that as well. So those are really the guys that I would say that looking back at it came, that went on to really achieve greatness in the big leagues with the Giants. That guys I enjoyed.
Doug, this is
Thanks,
the
Doug.
cover you were referring to. The Fresno Grizzlies.
Who's showing you this?
That's
Gary.
Posey and Bumgarner
Oh,
in the Grizzlies uniform. I don't know if you see it on the screen.
okay. I don't. I'm sorry. Gary has it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
no worries. See it or
Okay.
not.
So young.
All right.
He's holding up the magazine.
I don't know. Oh, there.
we're gonna
Okay,
go
there
to
you are.
Norm and
Yep,
then
that's
Steve.
correct. That's the
Yeah,
cover.
this is it.
Okay.
Doug, I've got a comment and a question for you. The comment is, one of my favorite moments at Candlestick occurred in the mid-'70s. A friend of mine, Robert Kaufman, and I used to get press passes. And we were standing behind home plate or behind the batting cage in batting practice. And this disheveled man starts walking towards us. His shirt is half tucked in, half out. His hair is flying all over the place. And we're looking at each other wondering, who is this guy? And he walks up to us. He starts talking. And with the matter of seconds to realize that this guy knows more about baseball than we do combined. And he was funny and articulate. And we loved this guy. And we'd see him every day for a few days. And he'd come and talk to us. And it was your father. And he was just a great guy. And I loved hearing him on the radio.
Well, I got to wait a minute. His shirt was half tucked out.
Yes.
Oh, and here's somebody that would always get on me if my shirt was 1 inch out. Really? Okay.
No, he was disheveled, I'll tell you. The question I have for you is, I'm curious about your highlights in terms of what are your favorite moments behind the mic?
Well, it didn't involve the Giants, but when the Grizzlies won the Pacific Coast League in 2015, the Astros were the first team into Fresno after the Giants, and that was a thrill to be behind the mic there because Fresno had never won a AAA championship, and the Astros and Giants had totally different philosophies when it came to AAA. The Giants would certainly put their talent there, but it was for a brief time, and they went to go win Major League World Series. The Astros had a much younger AAA team, but that was at the time where they were starting to rebuild. And I think that was exciting to call that. There's no doubt about that. I mean, regardless of the affiliate, that was a great moment. Trying to think here. I mean, I guess my highlight was your first ever day in the big leagues. I mean, I think you ask any player what one of their great highlights was. They might not say it was winning a World Series with a home run. Well, they might say that, but it's the first pitch I ever called doing a regular season major league game because that's the goal. The goal wasn't to call a AAA championship. That's nice. I enjoyed it. I got a ring for it, but it was a great team. Definitely was a great team. But I think the highlights were having a chance to call a major league game, a regular season major league game for the first time in Milwaukee in 2009. I think just the anticipation of that morning, and I wasn't so much nervous. I think I was just more anxious. It was like I got to the ballpark at 9:30. The game was at 1:05, and I'm thinking now it's 11:30, and I still got another hour and a half. I've already been here for 2 hours, but I would say that's the highlight. It wasn't really one call in that game. It was just doing the game. I mean, that I think was the highlight. I'm just trying to think some other things I enjoyed getting a chance to call the AAA All-Star game in Buffalo in 2012. That was an honor because the AAA All-Star game, it would be nationally broadcast, and it would be the home broadcaster always got the game. So if the game was in the Pacific Coast League, it was whoever did, the games at that park. And then it would be obviously one broadcaster from the other league. So it was a thrill to work with Ben Wagner, who's now part of the Toronto Blue Jays broadcast team. But at the time he was broadcasting for the Buffalo Bisons. And that was a thrill to call that game, because it was a different ballpark. I'm not used to calling a game in Buffalo. And it was fun just to be part of that. Another thrill was calling not just the Pacific Coast League Championship, but the AAA Championship, because they used to have the AAA Championship game, and the winner of the PCL and the winner of the IL would meet. It was more of just a showcase game to promote AAA baseball, but it was a one-game deal. And Fresno, the year we won the PCL, got to play Columbus, the Cleveland affiliate, and got to do the games with both Columbus broadcasters, Scott Leo and Ryan Mitchell, neither of whom I knew until I met them the night before. And that was tremendous working with them. Great guys, great broadcasters. And that was a lot of fun as well. So, those are the highlights. But I mean, ultimately, what's the goal? Is get to the big leagues. And that's people say, what's your favorite call? And it was any of those calls that day in Milwaukee.
Doug, how are you for time?
I got about another, let's see here, 15, 20 minutes. Okay.
Great.
We haven't taken the field yet for batting practice. And then I don't need to be down there for another 20 minutes or so.
We're going to go with Steve and then Charles.
Doug, only because you mentioned Andre Dawson. I don't know if I was with you, Gary, at Hall of Fame weekend when Dawson was inducted. You could add this story to your little speech there, Doug. When Andre Dawson was inducted, when he was called up to accept the plaque, he thanked a million people, including Mel Didier, who also lived in Arizona, was the scout at the time. But his main story was, you haven't had dinner until you have dinner with Tommy Lasorda. The reason being, Tommy Lasorda orders the biggest steak on the menu, eats half the steak, and then calls the waiter over and says, you know what? This wasn't cooked properly. So just leave it here and bring me another one. So he has a steak and a half. Anyway, I thought you might enjoy that story. That got a lot of laughs at the time. That's the way I said it.
Somebody had mentioned my father when he worked with Tommy Hutton, and I forgot who it was who mentioned Tommy. Okay. So I just did an interview with Tommy Hutton about a month ago. Tommy Lasorda was the scout who signed Tommy Hutton with the Dodgers in the 60s. And then Tommy Hutton would go and play for Lasorda when Lasorda managed Spokane, which was in the Pacific Coast League in the early 70s. And I asked Tommy Hutton, I said, was Lasorda the kind of flamboyant, promoter as he always was managing in the big leagues? And he said, absolutely. And everybody knew him in Spokane, especially all the restaurant owners. But any player that had a good game, Tommy would take care of, and he would take that player to dinner and order whatever you want. So yeah, I can, that makes sense.
Doug, referencing your debut with Milwaukee and the Giants, Steve and I were in the Hall of Fame that week. Was that the weekend where John Miller was inducted? Because we saw John Miller and Fleming up there together the same time during Miller's induction. I don't recall the year.
So no, that was a year later. The year I did the game in Milwaukee was 2009.
Okay.
No, that was a game that John was away each weekend back then because of ESPN, and then Dave and his wife Jessica were expecting their third child. That's why Dave wasn't there. 2010, that's when John was inducted into Cooperstown. Dave went with him, as any good partner would. And that's when I filled in Arizona because both guys weren't there then.
Right. Charles, you're up.
Yeah, I loved listening to Hank Greenwald. He was just awesome. I'm gushing, I know. One of the things I absolutely loved about him was he had such a great kind of sense of humor. It was dry, it was funny, was he like that in like at home in, I don't want to say real life, but I don't know if I'm making sense.
Not when I brought home my report cards.
Okay. But other times aside from that.
But after that, or sometimes you'd get a good laugh at them or a bad laugh. Yeah, you know what? People ask me that a lot, and he was that way at home quite a bit. That was his style. At the dinner table, if we were just watching a game at home, he'd always have a good sense of humor. That was something.
I remember some night that he was broadcasting, and it was the Giants had a lead, and it was really tight. And somebody, said, "Oh, this is a tight game," and he goes, "Yeah, love baseball, but you don't have to like these moments." And it was just so funny.
Well, yeah, he was one that he wouldn't take his work home with him,
Right.
He was, I always enjoyed watching a ball game with him because he would critique the players. Right. Obviously, if I was home with him, it wouldn't involve a Giant. Well, I guess over the course of time, it would once he was retired from them. But he would listen to the broadcasters, and there were times where he'd shake his head and say, "How's this guy be hired to broadcast a major league game?" I'm not going into names or anything. But
right. No, I wouldn't ask that.
He would kind of shake his head, but he always had a good sense of humor. Generally, we'd watch games sometimes, and my father, in his later years, really became a social media hound. Loved Facebook, loved email, loved to an extent message boards. He would like maybe write something about a hotel review or something. The only thing he didn't like was Twitter. He thought that was a bit much. He didn't. Now so-and-so is making their way in and they're tying their shoes in right field. And my dad was like, who cares? And I remember watching a Giant playoff game with him. And I remember Posey hits like a 3-run homer. And I'd say, man, all right, Giants have the lead. Posey comes through. My dad looked at me and says, how do you know that? So what do you mean, how do I know that, Dad? Aren't you watching the game? What do you mean, how do I know that? He's circling the bases. Well, his Twitter confirmed it. So, but no, the sense of humor was on the air and off the air. Yeah.
Doug, you've been in Fresno a long time.
Yes, I have.
Is the city upset basically being one step away from Major League Ball, AAA, to now being, single A?
My guess is yes. Yeah, I'd say so. I think that's affected our attendance a little bit. I guess you can point to a lot of things, the pandemic, and certainly, we weren't allowed full capacity until middle of last month. but yeah, it's definitely a drop. I mean, people enjoy, even when the Giants left, you'd still have guys that would be the next step from the big leagues. And if it was an Astros player or even a Washington Nationals player, people would say, hey, when do the Astros come to Oakland, or when do the Nationals come to San Francisco? Let's go see so-and-so. He was always great to my kids. And, we met him at a player season ticket holder party. It was always really nice. Now it's, guys get promoted, they're going to Spokane for high A. I mean, yeah, you have to take that first step. We get it, but it's not quite the same. These guys aren't going to be in the major leagues for another few seasons. Yeah, I would say that. I mean, yeah, it's a considerable drop. I don't think that the folks are too thrilled about it.
And Andy, go ahead.
Yes. First of all, I can vouch for Lee saying good things about your dad. Way back in 1987, Lee Lowenfish talked of how your dad and Mr. Hutton were very good announcers. I have a quick memory. In '88, down the stretch, Dave Stieb had bid for a couple of no-hitters. Your dad was doing the Yankee game that night. And I think as it turned out, Stieb allowed 4 hits or more than 3 in 3 games. And just like that, your dad said, who holds the record for giving up the least number of hits in 3 straight games? And the answer is probably the most obvious guy. The guy who pitched 2 straight no-hitters, and your dad imparted the information, 3-hitter in the other one. And last question, did he ever talk about his pro football work? I believe with Marty Glickman on the Football Giants shows.
Quite a bit. I know you're referencing Johnny Vandermeer, I guess, for the no hitters, which, as my dad said, that's a record that he thinks is pretty safe, that will never be broken. Yes, to the football work. My father was a closet New York Giants football fan. And, they're often where I'd come downstairs on a Sunday morning and we would have either a satellite dish when I was growing up, and then later we switched to DirecTV. So I'd come down, maybe 11 o'clock, football's already in the second quarter for the games back east. And one of the channels was always WCBS, channel 388 on DirecTV. I know that because it was always on there with my dad. And he was a New York Giants football fan. I think when the Giants played the Niners in football, he'd pull for the Niners. But if it was the New York Giants against just about everybody else, he was a New York Giants football fan because he used to, as you say, cover. I mean, he didn't do play-by-play for the New York Giants, but when he worked in Syracuse, and this was post-college, like media day, whatever day it was, Tuesday or Wednesday, was always down like around Fairfield University. I think the Giants had their training camp there. But he would go down toward New York. And then, of course, the games were at the Polo Grounds for the New York Giants way back in the day. So my father would go down and cover those games as a reporter. And I guess the days of Y.A. Tittle and, can't remember all the names back then, but yeah, he really was hooked on.
Sherman.
Allie Sherman. Yeah, that's right, who the coach was. He talked about Allie Sherman because usually he would interview him. But again, those were the days when he was growing up or going to college, I should say, in the mid 50s in Syracuse, when the NFL was now really starting to get going. And it was, long before the merger. So the New York Giants for many years, that was his team. And as I say, if the New York Giants football was on and, at 10 o'clock in the morning, California time, I'd come down and Dad was usually watching the New York Giants.
All right, we got time for one more question because we got to be nice to Doug. He's got a job.
I got a few more. I got another 10 minutes. I'm good.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to fire away?
I have
Lee, go ahead.
Well,
And then Jeff.
I thought I would like to ask Doug and really everyone about this is a sad day with the passing of Dick Tidrow. I was wondering if Doug had any encounters with him.
Yeah, all the time. I mean, with Dick, not just in Fresno, but remember, I don't know if you remember, but I did 2 years of the Giants AA games in Shreveport. So whether I'd see Dick in Shreveport, or then when I moved to Fresno, I would see Dick there. And of course, I'd see him every day at spring training. So I got to know Dick quite well. Not one to ever do an actual interview. He just didn't, that wasn't his thing. But he would sit and talk to you and tell you anything else, though, off the air. And I don't mean about players. I didn't really pick his brain much about Giant prospects. There was enough other people in the organization I could do that. I was more interested in hearing about Dick Tidrow's days as a Yankee, or his major league days, or coming up as an Indian. And one of my favorite Dick Tidrow stories was back when, I guess it was the late 60s, and things were a little different then. You know, hitchhiking was cool, and summer love and peace and all that. And Dick Tidrow was one of those kids of the late 60s. So his first pro assignment was Rock Hill, South Carolina, which is near Charlotte. I think it was the South Atlantic League. The Indians had a team. And I asked him about that. I said, what was Rock Hill like? And, well, you know, it was my first experience in the South. And I forgot what else he said. But I said, but then at least you got to go back toward the Bay Area. And as you all know, Dick was from the Bay Area, from the East Bay. And I said, what was it like, going to, play in Reno? And he said, well, it was nice being back out near California, but he said back in the day, and this I don't think would ever happen anymore, at least in terms of a cross country, that big a move. When he got promoted from Rock Hill to Reno, he said that the Indians back then allowed him to drive across the country. And I can't remember if he told me if he had with whom he was driving, or if he picked up anyone along the way, which back then that was a common thing. But I just remember him telling me it's one of those days or one of those, eras where minor league teams, you had to get your car there. Nowadays you have to get there immediately and they'll take care of shipping your car, or your car's going to stay wherever you were and you can borrow someone else's car and we'll fly you back to get it after the season. Back then, but I just remember that story. He was telling me that it was the 60s and he just enjoyed his drive from Rock Hill, South Carolina out to Reno. There was a lot more to Dick Tidrow's career than that, but that was one of the stories I seem to remember about Dick. And the other story that, he would tell me about is that the night that, and again, most of you being from New York, was in 1976, when Chris Chambliss won the pennant with his home run against the Royals. Dick Tidrow was the winning pitcher that game. And I said, man, Dick, I said, that's pretty cool. And, he kind of downplayed it. All he said was, well, I just was the right place at the right time. I was just a pitcher of record. I don't really think I did anything to really win the game. I just got the win that night. So those are a couple of things I remember about Dick. But I mean, just his I can only dream about knowing a third of what Dick Tidrow knew about baseball. But Dick Tidrow's fingerprints are all over those rings in San Francisco, that's for sure.
Thanks for sharing that, Chris. It hasn't made the papers yet, but there's a rumor that he drowned. And so,
I talked about that last night on my broadcast.
Yeah.
I mean, because I had heard that too. So I did mention that over the airway or or on the internet on the road games, but over the web, over the webcast, broadcast, whatever you want to call it, I did mention that.
Yeah.
He had apparently had a stroke a few months ago too.
Jeff, go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, hi. Hey, Kinder Kamek, how you doing?
Jeff, Jeff knows one of my cousins on the Greenwald side of the family, so he knows the Fisher family. So
yeah, councilwoman in Hoboken, New Jersey.
Yeah.
Anyway, one of the things that you didn't talk about all this evening, I don't know how many of these people might know it or not know it. One of the other big passions you've got is taking photographs of post offices all over the place. How many post offices have you actually gone to?
Well, I'm trying to catch up with Dan Taylor in that department. Dan's got about 6,000 of them, I think. Dan got me into it. No, joking. I got about 5,000 of them. I do have one that I literally have taken in all 50 states and Washington, D.C., but I don't have the one in Hoboken, Jeff, so we'll have to work on that one. No, how I got into it, it's just I love traveling the country. And how often, people will say, well, yeah, I drove through Ridgewood, New Jersey, or I drove through Darien, Connecticut, or I drove through this town of Michigan. I said, well, what'd you see in that town? Well, I didn't really see it. I just drove, I just saw the exit sign. Well, that doesn't count. Pumping your gas. I mean, I know you got to get gas, but that doesn't count. Stopping at the roadside diner, that's nice. Good diner. But you've got a picture of the post office. That's proof you've been in that town. And so that's one of the reasons. And a lot of them are historic buildings. I mean, you look at the one across the street from Madison Square Garden. It's been up since the 1930s. It takes up a whole city block. It's a historic building. It's got all the columns, and The one in Newark has a similar, so I'm just trying to give you some local examples. But a lot of them are buildings that are about 100 years old. That might have been WPA projects, or that might fit kind of a Spanish mission theme, some of the ones like in La Jolla or other places in Southern California. Some are little wooden shacks in Florida, or these little, kind of blends in right with Main Street and these little towns in Texas. It's a piece of Americana, and I take great pride in seeing our country, and that's a big part of it.
You have Oradell, or is it Riverdell? I'm not quite sure.
I have Oradell. I have most of them in Bergen County, Jeff, but I don't have Hoboken. Is Hoboken Bergen County?
No, it's Hudson.
All right. Well, you and I, next time I get back there, Jeff, you and I are going to travel around Hudson County. We'll stop at a diner, have some food, and we'll do the rest. I know you've been looking forward to that.
Doug, real quick, Doug. I gotta tell you, when was the last time you were in New York with that post office? Because they recently renovated it. Part of it now is the new Penn Station.
You know what? Actually, the last time I was in New York was, last time I was in New York was the night before everything got shut down. It was March,
Okay.
I don't know, 12th.
March
Yeah.
12th.
I was at the Big East basketball tournament. I had just finished seeing St. John's and Georgetown, and I think DePaul and Xavier, and so I was there that right then and there. So I literally was across the street from it at MSG. But I do remember seeing construction. I don't remember it was that trip, but maybe it was a prior trip.
Yeah, they've been doing internal work for a number of years, turning a good portion of I used to work at the Garden, so yeah,
Okay.
it was a great post office. But yeah, a good portion of it is now the new Penn Station.
Okay. Yeah.
Paul, why don't you finish it up, Paul?
Okay, Doug, this is a postal question also. Have you been to the Hyde Park Post Office? In Hyde Park, New York, FDR's home site?
No,
Home
Hyde
city?
Park. No, the Hyde Park is near Poughkeepsie, isn't it?
That's correct, yes.
Okay. No, but I've been to the Poughkeepsie post office, if that
Well,
counts.
if you want to go to the Hyde Park Post Office, it's a beautiful building on the outside, and because it's FDR, there are WPA murals all over it. You would really like
Okay.
it.
No, that sounds great. It's it's on my list among many things, but
Have you ever happened? I live close by, so if
but-
you ever decide you want to come up here, I'll be
No.
glad to show you.
Well,
Okay.
thank you. I appreciate it. I'm just going to add, aside from the whole post office thing, it relates to the New York Giants, is that I have a great love of seeing Giant Hall of Fame tombstones. And I want to share with all of you that I've been to the cemetery in San Antonio where Ross Youngs is buried. I've actually made 3 trips. He's still there. But he's buried next to his parents. And there's a little on his tombstone. There's there's like 2 bats kind of crisscrossing the handles of the bats like that in a ball. So I always, I wouldn't say always, but when I'm down in San Antonio, usually try and stop by there to say hello to Ross Youngs. Been over in Meeker, Oklahoma, to see the tombstone of Carl Hubble. There's a few baseballs that are right at his grave site. So I've certainly taken a picture of that. One other thing I want to share, as I said, I got about 5 minutes before I can go. We haven't quite taken the field yet for BP. And I know most people don't think of the following player as a Giant, but he did play for the New York Giants, and the last uniform he ever wore involved the home baseball team of the Polo Grounds, because he was the batting coach for the New York Mets in 1962, and that's Rogers Hornsby.
Yeah.
And I've not been to his tombstone, or his gravesite, whatever you want to call it. I am friends with his great grandson, Rogers the Fourth. So I mean, usually it's more Cardinal talk involving him, but he was certainly a part of the Giants' history as well. So but no, Ross Youngs is somebody asked about my favorite player, and nobody asked about my favorite player who I wish I could have seen. And I know most people would say, like Willie Mays, I think would be the most obvious, but in a way, I certainly have had a chance to meet Willie, numerous times through my dad. And I felt like, in a way, I've grown up seeing so much footage of Willie Mays. definitely would have loved to have seen Willie Mays play, of course. But in terms of, let's say, the old New York Giants, and that's where I'm going with this, is Ross Young's, because I think Ross Young's is really a forgotten Hall of Famer because he died when he was 30, and he was on pace for 3,000 hits. I think he had about 1,600 hits. I know that John McGraw always said that Ross Young's was his guy. I mean, John McGraw didn't say a lot of nice things about his players, but there were a few, and Ross Young's was one of them, because I think, McGraw was a kind of a gritty, hard-nosed, chips against him kind of player. So was Ross Young's. And I think that McGraw saw a lot of Young's in him, in McGraw. So I've always been fascinated with Ross Young's. I always have a love of the history of Texas, and he grew up in San Antonio and was born in a small town not far from there. So that's why when I went to the Hall of Fame a couple of years ago, I had access to the archive room, and the archivist said to me, "Is there any player you really want to look up and see, if we have anything on him?" I said, "Yeah, Ross Young's." And he looked at me and says, "Ross Young's? Why?" So of all the people that come up here, normally it's Babe Ruth or Lou Gehrig or Willie Mays. And why Ross Young's? So I told him the same reason I just told you. And it was fascinating to see, because it had, a lot of it had to do with his obits of him passing so young. He had, Graves' disease, which now would be curable, the kidney disorder. But Ross Young's was inducted in Cooperstown, I think it was 1972. And it really fascinated me because it had the diction of his acceptance speech, which obviously wasn't by him, but it was by his daughter. And it was just a couple of lines. She got up there and said, I can't remember verbatim what it was, but it was just, "We'd like to thank all the writers and the veterans for recognizing our father. Thank you very much." And then that's essentially was the gist of it. And it was just cool to see that, because there's no footage back then of it. But I was just really fascinated with as I say, with Ross Young's, because I just think that it was a guy that understandably never got his due, and would have probably was on pace to accomplish 3,000 hits. But no, that's one of them. I've enjoyed going back to watch the 1982 induction, Travis Jackson, when he was inducted, because that was on ESPN, but that's on YouTube. And because I think that was the same year that Hank Aaron and Frank Robinson were inducted. But to hear what Travis Jackson sounded like firsthand was great. But no, it's I certainly have a deep appreciation for the New York Giants, and fun to go back and see where some of these guys grew up, or you hate to use the term buried, but I mean that is a part of their history, to see who's with them around their gravesite.
Dan Taylor, first of all, thank you for setting this up.
Glad.
I know there's a mutual admiration society between you two men. Dan, what do you want to say about Doug's work?
Well, we've been very fortunate here in
Dan,
Fresno.
this is family television here. So.
No, we've been very fortunate in Fresno to have Doug here. It's just it's such a treat to be able to listen to him night in and night out, and I'm grateful for his friendship, and doors he's opened for me, and he's just a great friend. So glad that you guys all got to meet him and get to know him a little bit. And I'm really disappointed though when he was talking about players that he's met and highlights, and he didn't mention Max West, but we'll deal with that in a couple of weeks.
Well, that's right. We did get Max West. That's when Gus Zernial brought Max up to the game 2003. You were there that night, Dan?
I don't think so.
Okay,
but we've talked about it.
Okay, yeah, and just to share with everybody. Because my dad knew, certainly my dad grew up watching Gus. He didn't know Gus at all. Gus Earnley, I'm talking, but he met Gus when he came to Fresno, and Gus was one of my broadcast partners in 2003. And obviously, we all think the world of Gus. The reason why there's a downtown stadium in Fresno is because of Gus and the Carberry family. But Max West happened to be there that night. I know Max knew Gus through the Hollywood Stars and the old PCL. And my dad was up there, and he was talking to Gus, and my dad was just so amazed that my dad couldn't believe he was talking to Gus Zernial. Gus Zernial signed a postcard for my dad in 1953. Well, and then Gus says, "Hank, this is a friend of mine. It's a friend of mine, Max West." And my dad almost, Max West. Oh, my dad, so the little kid came out, and my 70-year-old dad. But no, Dan, thank you very much. Gary, thank you as well. All of you, thank you. Lee, great getting to hear from you. And again, thanks to
Give it up
everybody.
for Doug. Doug, thank you so much. Don't be a stranger.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you very much.
You know,
Great.
anytime, and you know,
Really
please keep me. I know Dan will keep me posted, but Gary, please keep me posted as well. And now I have the Hyde Park Post Office on my list. So
Okay.
Have a great
cool.
night. Call a good
All right.
game. All right.
thank you, guys.
Give
Be
it up
well.
for
Bye,
Doug.
Doug. Take
All
care.
righty.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Gentlemen, I will stay around if anybody wants to chat. Otherwise, we will see you maybe in